So welcome to Animal Science 1009 lecture on feeds and feeding. Our presenter is Dr. Scott Lake, professor in animal science and also works at the Laramie Research and Economics Center. So we're thrilled to have him. So thanks for doing this, Scott.
Sure. Thanks for having me. And so I guess at first they tell you to never apologize when you start a speech, but I don't get very many of these Zoom lectures, so it's a little bit awkward for me to sit here and talk to myself. So I'll try to keep a decent pace going, but we'll see how it goes. I've got quite a few slides that I want to go through. Some of them I'll go a little bit fast and then spend more time on others. So basically what we're going to talk about tonight, if we actually had you in class, this would be a 2 or 3 lecture class. So I've pared it down and going to kind of cover the highlights. I'm going to go over a little bit of digestive anatomy to start with. Kind of go through the 3 different types of systems I want to talk about, and then we're going to transition into more of the like a feed stuff type deal. I mean, both of these would be considered feeds and feeding, but we'll talk about hay, protein, energy, stuff like that, and end up with kind of how to balance a ration and show you a couple different ways, couple different examples. Some of them are a little harder than others, so I'll show you the hardest way I can and probably the easiest way I can. So with that, let's get started. My slides are not wanting to advance. Let me see what's happening. Okay, so the 3 different types of systems. First of all, monogastric. So you want to think about simple stomach animals. Those are going to be your pigs, your chickens and turkeys, your dogs, your cats. People would be considered monogastric, simple stomach animals. Okay, so and I'm going to go through the examples here. Ruminant animals, I'm sure most of you are aware, we're going to have multi-compartment stomach. And I will tell you this again, and so it's a common, I don't want to say misperception, but I think we always consider a ruminant animal to have 4 stomachs, right? Well, technically that's incorrect. We're going to say a ruminant animal has 1 stomach, but they have 4 different parts. And so that's going to obviously include most of the livestock that we deal with, beef cattle, dairy cattle, goats, sheep, but also any of your wild ungulates. When you talk about elk, deer, buffalo, they're all considered ruminants. Some of them might be a little bit different variation, but really what we're talking about in a ruminant animal is he's going to ferment feeds up on the front end of his digestive system, whereas the next group are going to be called hindgut fermenters. So really they still have a simple stomach. They they don't have the compartments in their stomach like the ruminant animal does, but they have they ferment feeds on the back end of the system, such as in horses and rabbits. So I'm not going to go through an example of everything I've got listed here, but I'm going to show you an example of one from each category. Before we get started with that, let's go through a few definitions. So if I happen to mention them or say something technical, you know what I'm talking about. So if I was in class, I'd be asking questions here, but I don't want to put Isabella on the spot, and I'm not exactly sure how to use this chat, so I won't do that. So the tube from the mouth to the anus through which food is digested, absorbed, and solid waste is excreted, we're going to call the alimentary canal. This is true for no matter what species we're talking about, whether or what digestive category we're talking about. Simple stomach, ruminant, hindgut fermenters, okay, alimentary canal. So the simplistic diagram, and you watch this, I borrowed this slide. I did not realize this was on here until I saw this. But so food goes in, enters the stomach, goes through the intestine. Now, if we're in a hindgut fermenter, we're going to undergo fermentation back here in the cecum and the large intestine. And then out the back end. So, a few more definitions. The breakdown of large insoluble molecules into a simpler compound we're going to call digestion. That's just the broad spectrum of what is digestion, okay? So if you think about it this way, we've got a sandwich, or if we're feeding our cattle, we got a bucket of grain. There's going to be 3 steps to digestion. The first one is the mechanical step. Okay, that's actually taking food in the mouth, chewing it up, so that it's broke down into smaller particles. That's going to be the mechanical side of it. The chemical side of it is going to be whether we're talking about an acidic stomach, a simple stomach, or a fermentation vat and a ruminant animal. It's then going to go chemical digestion. So once we chew on food, once it's broken down into smaller particles, from a molecular standpoint, they're still really big particles. So we need to break those particles, those compounds, maybe it's a protein, and we need to break them down into individual amino acids. If it's a carbohydrate, we need to break it down into glucose so that when those chemicals or those molecules get to the small intestines, they can be absorbed. And then lastly is the microbial part of digestion, which is the absorption, and whether it be within the intestinal lining somewhere. Okay, so some more definitions. The actual taking in of feed or water, we're going to say is prehension. The reduction of feed particle size or chewing is mastication. The act of swallowing is I have a hard time saying that one. Deglutition. And regurgitation is the casting up of undigested materials. And so again, I'd be asking you questions if you were sitting here, which animals do use regurgitation exclusively? A lot of animals can regurgitate, right? But ruminant animals rely upon regurgitation for their digestive process. And in this hour lecture, I'm not going to get too much into depth, but it's really critical for them to be able to eat a large amount of feed, go lay down, and they regurgitate it. And that's why they regurgitate it, is they're actually chewing it back up into a smaller particle size and re-swallowing it. So here's an example of the digestive tract of a pig, okay? So, hey, Warren, can you see my mouse on that screen?
I can.
Okay. So when an animal eats feed, chews it up, swallows it, goes down through the esophagus and into the stomach. Now remember, a pig is a simple stomach. So they've all got a mouth, which is where mastication occurs. The reason, and I think I said this already, the reason we need to chew up feed and not just swallow it is because we're breaking it down, and anytime we create smaller sizes of something, we've increased the surface area. So with an increased surface area, it's smaller, those digestive enzymes can more attack the feed better, break it down even further than if it was a big solid mass that don't get on the outside of it. Every species, including us, we have saliva that does a couple different things. First of all, it contains enzymes, also acts as lubrication to be able to swallow and get feed down easier. So for the act of eating and swallowing, obviously tongue, lips, teeth, in our case hands, really important for gathering food, putting it in. You think about the different species and how they eat. A lot of them use their tongues. Lips, horses really use their lips to nibble feed, and they've got, the front incisors, top and bottom, and they can really chew that food finely. So the esophagus, just a muscular tube that connects the mouth to the stomach. Let me get to the bottom of this. So we're going to consider the stomach when it gets down into this section right here. It's going to basically be storage, right? So we're going to chew it up, swallow it, get it to the stomach. Now in a simple stomach animal, it's really acidic. The pH is about a 2. So it's really acidic. This is where most of the enzymes digest protein, carbohydrates are starting to digest, but it thrives in that low pH environment, very acidic environment. But it takes time for all that to happen. So the stomach is really a storage area. It's going to hold the feed for a certain amount of time, let it be broke down, and then it passes. Now within the liver, which on my screen this is really small, but when it sits in here is the liver, it provides bile, which comes from the gallbladder, which is kind of nested within the liver. So this is going to help us for fat digestion. So this is true in all monogastrics. Not all, I guess I will tell you an example in a minute. So it's attached to the underside of the liver. So it's a storage of bile. That's where bile is stored once it's produced, and then it's secreted and helps for the digestion of fat. Okay, so the pancreas, I'm going to go through these organs kind of fast because you're going to get this in much more in depth in college. But pancreas, we're going to provide enzymes for digestion of lipids, but mostly for carbohydrates. It's going to regulate blood levels, insulin, so that it helps with the digestion of carbohydrates and proteins. Small intestine, we're going to look at it as 3 sections, okay? We're going to have the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. So in these 3 sections, it's the primary site of digestion, okay? Enzymatic digestion, I should say. So it's already been broken down into small particles, and this is where absorption is going to occur. This is how, in simple stomach animals, most of our energy is taken in, and then it's going to go to the liver, okay? And I already said that. So the lining of the small intestines has all these finger-like projections. And it's going to be the same thing when we talk about the rumen having papillae. What that does is increase the surface area so that absorption can occur over a greater spectrum of tissue rather than if it was smoothly lined. So the cecum, that would be back here on this diagram. In humans, we don't have a functional cecum, okay? If people get their appendix out, the appendix is actually the cecum. So in people, we don't really have a use for it. We don't use it. Food can get in there, can get infected, or there's a lot of different reasons why, but then it can become inflamed and need to be removed. So in monogastrics, it's not really very functional. There is some microbial fermentation that occurs in there. And as I get to the horse, I'll show you that it's actually pretty important. So the large intestine, so we went through this 3 sections of the small intestine. Then we've got the large intestine. That's going to be made up of 2 sections, which will consist of a large and a small colon. There's going to be a fair amount of microbial fermentation that occurs there, but this is the big site for water absorption. So this is where most of the water absorbed from the GI tract. And then rectum, obviously, this is where feces are formed and expelled. So that would be a simple monogastric animal. Let's look at the horse for a few minutes. So the big difference here, horses still, if we cut it in half right here, we still say this horse is a simple stomach animal, right? He's got the stomach up front, it's got the small intestines, but when we come back here, this is the big difference in horses, and this is why we would consider him a hindgut fermenter, is he's got a functional cecum. So if you think about how this digestive tract is functioned or set up, compared to a ruminant animal, it's really backwards, right? We got front end fermenter, hind gut fermenter. Think about digestive problems. Horses colic over everything, right? They're digestively kind of sissies. They have problems all the time. The reason is because the fermentation is on the back end of the system. So that's why they have problems, can be absorbed, or just have gut aches up here in the front. Cows, they can eat lots of bad stuff that doesn't bother them. When we talk about bacteria and mold and stuff like that, it may technically affect them, maybe performance-wise, but they don't have nearly the digestive problems as a horse does. And this is why, is because the fermentation is on the back end of a horse rather than the front end. So the mouth, stomach, liver, pancreas, small intestine, very similar to monogastric. They have the same basic functions. Okay, horses lack the ability to regurgitate. And I'm actually drawing a blank. They have a 3-way bicuspid valve, a 1-way valve, okay? And so I've always heard, can't tell you if this is technically correct or not, I need to hear it from a vet. But if you have a horse that regurgitates, he's probably going to die because that's really bad. So horses don't puke. Cows and other animals can regurgitate. Horses can't. I told you that all monogastric animals have a gallbladder. Well, not in horses. Okay, they don't have one, so their fat metabolism is a little bit different. Um, and compared to the others, they have exceptionally large and complex large intestine compared to monogastrics. And even ruminant animals, because ruminant animal, a little bit of microbial fermentation occurs, water absorption occurs, but the large intestine in these hindgut fermenters is much more complex. So I already said this, the cecum of the large intestine is very similar to the rumen, right? That's where the fermentation process occurs. If we were talking more into a digestive physiology class, we'd be talking about volatile fatty acids. Some of the carbohydrates, when they're in ruminant animals and these hindgut fermenters, when we digest carbohydrates, they're broken down into what we call volatile fatty acid or VFAs. In a ruminant animal, they're absorbed within the rumen, some of them in the small intestine, but mostly within the rumen. In the horse, those VFAs are not produced until we get back there in the large intestine, and they're still absorbed, and then they're basically reconfigured into energy once it's absorbed within the liver. So the microbes, the same as in ruminants, digest fiber. Fiber produces VFAs. VFAs are converted to energy. Okay, so this is a interesting fact that I actually didn't realize I'd put on these slides. In a cow, and again, I don't mean to get too deep into digestive physiology here, but in a cow, the rumen is a huge microbial vat, right? So it allows a cow to eat really poor quality forage and convert it through fermentation to create these volatile fatty acids and use it as an energy source. Well, the microbes themselves are made of protein, and so they have a very short lifespan. So microbes will actually die, and then they get flushed through the system, and they can actually be absorbed as a protein source for cattle. So they actually use the microbes once they're dead. They go into I'm going to do the ruminant animal next, but they go into the last chamber of the stomach, which would be similar to a simple stomach animal. So it's very high acidity, low pH, and they're able to utilize that as microbial protein. Horses do not. They have those microbes in the large intestine, but it's just wasted. They're just excreted once their lifespan is done. So here's the digestive tract of a ruminant animal. Again, mouth, esophagus is going to be very the same. So here's our 4 compartments. We're going to have the reticulum, the rumen, the omasum. Where's it on here? I actually don't have it labeled on here. The omasum and then the abomasum, okay? The abomasum is going to be our simple stomach. It's the last compartment, low pH, just like a simple stomach animal. Therefore, it can break down those proteins even further. And then small intestine, site of absorption in ruminant animals, and then large intestine, mostly water absorption. So I think this is everything I just said. I tend to get ahead of myself on these slides, but so here's probably a better picture of all 4 compartments, okay? So the omasum, so as food comes down, it actually drops into the reticulum, and I'm going to show you a couple slides in a minute. It's a honeycomb structure. It's kind of a pouch that sits there at the bottom of the esophagus, and that's where the food first enters. And then the reticulum also helps with the regurgitation process. And as it comes back down and it's been chewed on a little bit, it goes into the next compartment, and it's a pretty open compartment. Is the big vat, the big fermentation vat of the rumen. So once particles are broken down there, they actually flow into the abomasum. And again, I've got some pictures in a minute, but it's a structure that is, I don't know how to describe it. It's actually round, looks like a ball, and it has all these different leaves in it. So it's really compact. It's hard and dense if you actually feel one. It feels kind of like about the size of a basketball. So there's a lot of absorption that occurs in there. And then the last compartment is what we'd call the true stomach or the simple stomach. it's the abomasum. So low pH, help for digesting protein. So most of the stuff I just told you. Oops. So they all three of the upper compartments contain microbes, really important for fermentation. I told you the reticulum is really important for allowing them to regurgitate for cud chewing. So the reason, I mean, it's speculation, right? But the reason evolutionarily animals evolved the way they did, ruminant animals are designed to eat a large quantity of food very fast. And so you think about elk and deer, like when you go hunting in the early morning, late at night, because that's when they're out. So cows are similar from an evolution standpoint, that they're go out, eat a whole bunch of food, and then it allows them to go back into the trees, lay down, and then they can chew that cud all day, break it down, and allow for digestion. So that allows them to avoid predators during the daytime and rest and chew their food during the day. So here's the reticulum. So you can see this honeycomb pattern on there. So it's going to catch and hold the coarse materials that come down. The other thing that it will catch is wire and nails. If you guys have ever heard of hardware disease, we've got a picture here that so you get a nail in there. A lot of times it'll catch it. You can, if you know that they've eaten it or suspect it, you can shove a magnet down their throat and it'll get stuck there and basically stay in there their whole life. But it'll catch that nail and keep it from pushing through. If that nail is in there, can't get my mouse over here. If that nail is in there, it will actually start rubbing in that wall, cause an infection, cause irritation, can actually poke through the wall, and a lot of times that would be pushing right up against the heart. So they've had animals die, and they'll have a nail in their heart, and that's where it came from, is through the reticular wall there. So obviously once it gets to that point, they're going to die. So the rumen, large vat, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just wanted to show you the size of this vat in a mature, and that's not even a big cow. That's actually a pretty small cow. Maximum capacity, we're talking 50 to 60 gallons. So it's a huge vat, holds a tremendous amount of material. Here, look, within a U, we're talking 5 to 10 gallons. Okay, in the rumen stomach, there's a lot of bacteria, protozoa, different funguses. So their job is to digest forage. Low quality forage, turn it into a volatile fatty acid, create microbial protein, and also help digest or absorb water soluble vitamins. Okay. So here's a picture of those papillae. I mean, there's millions of them. If you see the lining of a rumen, it actually changes with diet. So the higher fiber diet, they're going to have larger papillae. If you ever go to grad school and you have to do these different, and you're a nutritionist, you do these different studies and cut open a lot of animals and look at stomachs. But in a feedlot concentrate type animal, they're going to be much smaller because that is a more readily available carbohydrate. And this one, it's actually healthier the higher the pH. So when you're in a feedlot animal and it's a low pH, it's not quite as healthy. So the papillae are smaller, and plus the VFA, there needs to be more room for absorption. Kind of looks like a 70s shag carpet. There would be an actual picture of what that would look like. Okay, so we all know about, you probably heard how cows are ruining the environment because of their gas. Most of the time we think of gas out the rear end, right? But honestly, they produce most of their gas out belching. So we should be worried about burps more than the other end. You can see they produce a tremendous amount of gas. Gas also can lead to bloat. Again, we're not going to really get into bloat. That's more of a digestive physiology problem. But if we have animals that bloat often or bloat too severely, it can kill them. Mostly due to pressure on the diaphragm, they can't breathe. Here's just an interesting comparison for the different species. Obviously, there's no fermentation compartment in the swine and the horse, but you can see how large they are. But look at the intestine and compare those to each. The small intestine similar in size, but look at the large intestine length or capacity, I guess. In a cow, which is a really big animal, there's like 10 gallons of capacity. And in a horse, we're talking 30 to 35 gallons of capacity. So again, just because it's a hindgut fermenter and there's more utilization in the hindgut. So that's kind of my brief overview of digestion and the three different types of categories that we categorize them in. So let's transition now to more livestock feed classification, and again end up with how we balance a ration. So let's do a little terminology. Oftentimes we will just use a generic broad category of feedstuff. So our definition of a feedstuff is just a material that we can use as feed. Okay, pretty simple. We're going to talk about different classifications of nutrients. So any nutrient, whether it be, and they'll be like energy, protein, just roughage, they all can be considered feedstuffs. Our diet, we're going to call a mixture of feedstuff to supply nutrients, okay? So one thing to keep in mind that will drive a nutritionist crazy, feed is animal feed. Food is people. So we don't consider hay to be food for cows. It's feed. Seems simple, but it's you can get yourself into a little trouble in a nutrition class. So our ration is going to be the whole mixture of feed, okay? Whether that be a mostly forage diet or whether it be a mostly concentrate diet, we're going to call that our ration. So approximate analysis, I don't know how many of you guys know what approximate analysis is or talked about it. I would guess in your ag classes, animal science type classes, you should probably at least have covered this a little bit, but I'm not positive. So basically it's just an analytical procedure so that we can know what the nutrient analysis of any given feed is. Okay, it was delivered in Germany. Not important. So dry matter. This one seems very simple, right? So the dry matter of a feed is just the feed, whether it be hay, which is very dry, or silage, which is very wet. So if we actually take a sample of it, we put it in an oven for 48 hours at a certain temperature, it dries it down. So we weigh it before it went in, weigh it when it came out. So you take 100% of it minus the water content, and that gives us our dry matter percentage. Now this seems very simple and it almost seems irrelevant, but this is extremely important. Because if I need to know what percentage of diet or how many pounds of energy I'm trying to feed an animal, the wetter it is, the more important this is. So corn silage, for instance, if I'm feeding corn silage, it's going to be 65% moisture. Well, if I calculate a feed at 90% moisture versus a feed at 65% moisture, those are two different amounts. And I need her to consume 20, if it's a cow, I need her to at least eat 20 pounds of dry matter a day. Well, that's going to be like 40 or 50 pounds of corn silage compared to 30 pounds of hay. So I hope this makes sense. Really important that we know what the dry matter of a feed is. We can't really correctly balance a ration without that. I'm going to show you a chart in a minute with approximate analysis. So ash is just the minerals. Crude protein, that's going to be the nitrogen content that we look at within a feed. So when we balance a ration, usually we're balancing for protein. That's probably the number one thing that we balance for. Crude protein is how you calculate it. It's the nitrogen content of the feed. So what we do is take the nitrogen content of the feed and multiply it by 6.25. And the reason we came up with 6.25 is because the average protein has 16% nitrogen. So if you think about protein being made of amino acids and they all have an amino group to it, the average amount of protein or nitrogen that is in that is 16%. So 100 divided by 16 gives us 6.25. So that's how we came up with that. Ether extract is the fat component of feed. So if you see the term ether extract, that just simply means fat. Crude fiber, usually made up of cell wall material. Depending on the plant stage of maturity, it can be either highly digestible or lowly digestible. So very, very ambiguous, I guess I'd say. It's consisted of cellulose, hemicellulose, pectin, and lignin. Cellulose is very fermentable. Lignin is almost not, digestible. Lignin is almost not digestible. Okay, then we're gonna have our nitrogen-free extract, which is basically our carbohydrates, starches, sugars, stuff like that. We don't really analyze for that. We just calculate that by what the difference is. So I will show you this process. So if we take a feed sample and we want to go through this whole process, we're going to dry it, take the water out of it. That gives us our dry matter intake. We analyze it from there. It will separate the ash out of it, which is basically minerals. Ash is always considered minerals. And then we have organic matter. So ash is inorganic matter. Organic matter is still digestible. So from our organic matter, we can either have the nitrogen-containing component, which would be our crude protein, or the non-nitrogenous matter, okay? Then we go on further. Our non-nitrogen matter is either going to be fat, which does not contain nitrogen, or carbohydrates. Or carbohydrates can go down to either being crude fiber, or it can be a nitrogen-free extract, such as starch, okay? So let's work through a few examples of the different classes of feedstuffs that we have. So to start with, dry forages, roughages. Let me get to the bottom of this and talk about them. So our dry forages, we're talking about hay, basically. I mean, especially in this country, is we're going to cure it, or cut it, cure it, store it. So it's going to be very high in fiber and most of the time low in energy. Okay, so examples of that would be different hays, legume hay, which is alfalfa, clover, or grass hays, which are common varieties around here, would be brome grass and timothy. Fescue is more of a Midwestern type grass. And then we've also got our crop residues. If we're feeding corn stalks, if we're feeding straw, if we're saving pasture that maybe we did hay, we didn't graze it, and we're saving it for winter time, if we live in an area that doesn't get buried with snow. So weathered grass doesn't have a whole lot of nutrient component into it. If we got, again, more of a digestive physiology class, but we would talk about just the need for animals to have dry matter intake, and we can supplement either protein or energy, but we need a volume of, and it can be low quality forage that they need to be able to consume. One thing I want to say here about low energy, a lot of people would consider alfalfa hay as being high in energy. Truth be told, it's a decent protein source, but on an energetic basis, it's not any different than grass hay. So when we're feeding cows, when we're feeding, well, anything, we don't consider alfalfa to be high in energy. It's high in protein. So important distinction there. Different sorts of crop residues. Here in Laramie, we don't have the option of having many of these, but a lot of you probably live in different areas around the state that we can bale, or we can be grazing corn stalks. We don't even have much straw around here, but you could feed straw. Baled corn stalks, all of those can act as a low quality forage source to add low quality fiber to the diet, usually really inexpensive. Here's a photo of comparison of just grass versus alfalfa hay. You can see that alfalfa hay is much more stemmy, has leaves in it, and the leaves is where most of the nutrients are at. grass just simply is what it is. It's just dried cut grass. Excuse me. So our pastures or forage feeds, pretty obvious, right? So we can graze pastures fresh, a lot higher energy concentration in the feed until it reaches maturity, until it starts to dry or it heads out and mature. Then all of the energy of the plant goes into the seed. So when it's growing and it's fresh, it's really high in energy, really high in nutrients. But once it goes to seed, it's really not. So we can kind of manage around that. And there's different types of grasses that grow in different environments. So we got warm season or cool season grasses, and those can be different. A lot of people will feed fresh chop, which is basically just feeding it chopped instead of ensiling it. I think I'm going to talk about silage next. Yeah. Let me get to the bottom here. So silages, and again, we don't put up any here, but I mean, if you live in the Wheatland, Torrington area, up in the basin, Sheridan, where you can grow hay or corn, you can put up silage. And silage is an excellent feed. So what it does, it's anaerobic fermentation. So when we ensile something, we pack it so it's airtight, and then a fermentation process goes and it basically preserves it. A lot of that fermentation converts glucose or the starches into a volatile fatty acid, and that can act as a preservative because it's so low in pH. So examples are we can ensile corn silage, we can actually ensile grass, and you can create a haylage, and there's even baleage. And so it's all the idea of anaerobic fermentation preserving the forage. And it does preserve the nutrient content of the forage. So sorghum silage, here's a picture of sorghum silage, alfalfa stored as haylage, and corn silage. There's kind of a picture of we can store silage in a lot of different forms. Chop it, pack it in a pit like this, and as long as it's packed tight, it'll ferment nicely. Here would be a silage pit. You can see it kind of forms a crust around the edge that kind of maybe isn't the highest quality, but underneath it is where it's fermented and it preserves. So things you need to think about when feeding silage is if I have a silage pit like this and I've got this whole portion here that we'd call the face of the pit, if I'm not feeding it enough, it can spoil on you. So we need to be able to be feeding that within a couple days to clear out that face and always bringing out new stuff. Otherwise, the old stuff here will actually spoil. So really important to know your feeding program, how much you're feeding, how quickly you go through stuff. We don't see a whole lot of silos out in this country, but if you go through the Midwest, you see a lot of silos, and they store them with corn silage, pack them all the way up. So let's talk about different classes of feed. So energy feeds. So when we think about, we got forages, now we're going to talk about energy feeds, often referred to as concentrate type feeds, and protein feeds. So on the energy side, most energy feeds are low in protein. So we're going to consider an energy feed something that's less than 20% protein, and it's really low in fiber, less than 18% crude fiber. So that's going to be where your grains come in. They're high in starch and or fat, such as cereal grains, corn, oats, barley, rye, wheat. Those are all excellent energy sources. We can also have byproducts that are energy sources. Now, a lot of these byproducts don't necessarily fit the definition that I gave you up here. Take distiller's grains. It's actually pretty high in fiber, but it's a very fermentable, digestible fiber, and it's actually high in protein. It can be up to 30% protein. So we would consider it a protein, and we can use it as a protein source, but energetically, it's almost the same as corn. If fed at, again, I don't want to get into the details, kind of getting into the weeds here, but if we feed it at low amounts, like less than 25% of the diet, it has a feeding value the same as corn. So it's really high in energy. It's, in my mind, as a supplement, almost the perfect cattle feed. because it's high in protein, it's high in fiber, but it's really digestible fiber, and it's really high in energy, can be high in fat also. It's a really good supplement to feed cattle. And then some of these other feeds, if you guys are into showing, you'll know a little bit about beet pulp, cottonseed. They're good fiber sources. A lot of people use them because they'll fill an animal, make them look nice and full. Fats and oils, obviously, to add energy to the diet. In a cow diet, a mature cow diet that is on a forage-based diet, fats at fed over 5% of the diet can actually decrease digestibility of the forage. So we don't feed a lot of high-fat diets to cows. Now, if we're feeding a concentrate diet, like in a feedlot or show animals, the same thing happens, but they're deriving such little amount of energy from the forage because we're feeding them so much corn that it doesn't matter. So we're losing a little digestibility off of that forage, but in this case, it doesn't matter because we've made more than made up for it with the rest of the diet. So fats is something that's it's a different answer. If somebody talks about feeding fats, whether it's a feedlot animal versus a cow out grazing in the pasture. So here, I'm sure you guys have all seen different pictures, and these would be whole grains. So corn, oats, barley, rye, wheat. Most of the time when we feed them, they're cracked, rolled, steam flakes, something like that. Anytime that we can process them, just like I told you within the system, anytime we break them down, increases the surface area, allows for greater digestibility, right? So if we steam flake it or we crack it, we're going to get a little bit more energy out of that corn than if we just feed whole shelled corn. Same thing with all of them, okay? Byproduct feeds, again, you've probably seen most of these different ones. Some of these maybe you haven't seen, some milo, millet. We don't have a ton of that around here. Everybody feeds a lot of soybeans, whether you feed pigs or sheep or goats or cattle, but it's usually ground soybean meal. So it's gone through that extraction process where the fat and a lot of different components are taken out of it, and you probably don't even see it in the diet because it's more of a fine powder. Usually will be in a pellet or something. And then different fats. Molasses is something that we feed. Molasses does add palatability to the diet, but the main reason we feed molasses probably is to add texture to the diet. It keeps it moist, keeps it fresh. Will also allow us to feed like a mineral. So if we have a diet mixing, minerals are super fine particle and it's usually pretty heavy. So if we put it in a dry diet and mix it, the mineral will sort to the bottom. But if we can mix it with molasses, it will tend to stick to the molasses and we can keep it uniform throughout the diet. So acts as, again, palatability, a binder to keep the diet together, to help keep it fresh. And then the last one I would say is we add fat and molasses to the diet as to keep the dust down. So that, when you have ground corn in the diet, you're going to see it's going to get a lot of dust. When it's really dusty, the cattle inhale it, gets in their lungs. It's not great for them. So we like to keep diets without dust, and molasses and even oil is a good way to do that. So let's talk about proteins for a minute. Okay, just like I said on the energy is less than 20%, so proteins are going to be greater than 20%. So it can be animal origin. We're mostly going to stick with plant origin. Due to BSE concerns, we don't really feed animal proteins back. We don't feed ruminant animals back to ruminant animals. We used to be able to use a meat and bone meal. It would be basically scrap that was ground up and could be put back into meat, but because of the concerns with BSE, we don't really do that anymore. So most of our plant origin, soybean meal, cottonseed meal, corn gluten meal, I would put distillers grains in that. There's a few others, but those are the main ones. Now, the other source of protein that we have is non-protein nitrogen. Okay, so, and what that means is, think about what I said before, all protein contains nitrogen from the amino groups from amino acids, right? So if we have a non-protein nitrogen, that means we're getting our nitrogen source from something other than an amino acid. We can only feed it to ruminants, so it'd be ammonia. Same thing that we fertilize fields with, right? So if you feed this to horses or simple stomach animals, it's actually toxic. So we only feed this to ruminants. The reason we can feed it to ruminants is because they've got that fermentation vat. Well, those bugs need to be fed. So they need a nitrogen source. So they can actually utilize ammonia, incorporate it into the amino acids which they need to survive. So the example is urea. There is a percentage, I'm going to tell you that off the top of my head, it's 25% that we can feed non-protein nitrogen. And when I say that, it's not 25% of the diet, it's 25% of the protein fraction of the diet. So if you think about a cow's diet, she has a 10% protein requirement. That means only of her 10, if it's just for this example, let's say it's 10 pounds, just because math is easier. It wouldn't be 10 pounds, it'd be more like 1. But if it's 10 pounds, that means we could only feed 2.5, right? That'd be 25%. And then the last one we talk about, mineral supplements. We need to keep our calcium, phosphorus ratios right. We need to feed salt. We need to feed vitamins. Vitamins are one of the more overlooked things that we feed. And we can get into a whole discussion about chelated versus inorganic. And in this one, we're really not going to talk about that. I don't have time. But there are different mineral types out there. The most important thing, I wouldn't get bogged down of whether I'm feeding an organic versus inorganic mineral. I would make sure you're feeding a mineral. Meet the requirements. And then if you have questions, you want to kind of optimize performance, talk to a nutritionist, go from there. But minerals are extremely important for performance. We can neglect minerals and they will still be alive. They will still look fine in some cases, but you will be losing performance, losing in the show side, you're losing look and performance. So really important. Yeast, there's a lot of supplements that Diamond V is probably one of the biggest producers of yeast. There's also different direct fed microbial companies. I keep referring to the show guys. A lot of you guys are show kids. If you've heard of gut candy, it's a yeast supplement, and it's healthy for the gut. So it's like a probiotic. It does them good. It's not necessarily the same as a probiotic, but it's doing the same thing. It's just keeping the stomach healthy, increases digestion. And then oils. Again, feeding oils to ruminants is a little bit more tricky. Then we've got non-nutritive feed additives, such as antibiotics, hormones, medications, preservatives. If you guys are familiar with any of this, rumensin increases efficiency in cattle. Optiflex and Paline are the same thing. Optiflex is for cattle, Paline is for pigs. Tyline is an antibiotic. These two are growth promotants. So we can increase lean muscle mass by feeding these right at the end of their life. All right, just a few more minutes. I'm going to go through a couple examples. And the good thing is this is recorded, so if I go too fast for you, you don't understand, you can hit rewind. So general rules for ration formulation, okay? The first thing we need to do is figure out what we're feeding. How big is it and how fast do I want it to grow? If it's a mature animal, what stage of life? Is she producing milk? Is she dry, as in she's not producing milk and she's early gestation? Her requirements are a lot less. Is she late in gestation? Her requirements go up, and her requirements are always at the highest is when she's at peak lactation. So we need to know what animal we're feeding. We need to know her stage of growth, those sorts of things, okay? So all of our requirements are based off of what we always refer to as NRC, okay? And it's a publication. I used to have a picture in here. I think I blocked it out of here, but there's a publication for basically every species that you want to know. If you raise sheep, you raise cattle, and it's very scientific, so it's easier to just get the tables that you can easily look at. But if you're kind of wanting to know the science behind it, knock yourself out. But it's the nutrient crime of all of them, and they also have tables in there showing you the nutrient composition of the most common feed stuff. So if I'm balancing a ration, let's say I've got a steer, he is 750 pounds. I want him, whether I own a feedlot or whether I have a show steer, I know I want him to reach 1,350 pounds, and it needs to reach it by August 1st. I can calculate how far that is, determine how many pounds a day I want it to gain. I can look at the feed tables and figure out the nutrient content of corn, soybean meal, whatever nutrients I have, and balance a ration. So that's what I'm going to give you in just a second. So we select the feeds we want to use, okay? So we're going to, obviously species dependent, depends on how fast we want it to grow. We can pick different feeds that have high energy or just moderate energy, okay? A lot of times we need to be worried about cost. If we're doing it on a production setting, we always want to do what we call a least cost ration so that we can maximize it. If we're more into performance and show, maybe we're not quite as worried about the ration because we're more worried about the end product. Okay. We want to, basically it's still the same as figuring out what nutrient type we want. We're going to maximize roughages. We always want, especially if we are pushing animals, we want to keep a certain amount of roughage in the diet. And if we were in a live class, I'd kind of quiz you down about this, and I would show you a graph. The reason in feedlots that we feed more grain, they obviously grow faster, but they grow more efficiently, okay? And it has to do with digestibility. So we can break down corn starch easier than we can break down grass. Okay, we can get to the same volatile fatty acid in each of them, I mean, relatively speaking, but turning it into energy into a form that the body can use takes much more energy from the forage side than it does the corn side. So it gets there a lot easier, provides a lot more of it. But we can make them sick. We can cause acidosis. We can cause them to bloat, those sorts of things if we don't keep enough roughage in the diet. So really important to keep enough roughage. Now in this slide, I said you want to minimize the use of protein. We don't want to feed excess protein because if you guys are familiar with the Atkins diet in people, it doesn't work the same, but it's similar. They're not as efficient utilizing protein, and we can actually pull a little bit of fat off of animals by feeding high amounts of protein. So, and traditionally, protein's more expensive. So we just want to know exactly what our requirements are and target that and build around the protein requirement, okay? The second thing is to always check your work. We could overfeed an animal and we could have even fatal results because of it, okay? All right, so here's the first example. I'm gonna show you 3 different ways to do this, okay? The first one's probably the most complicated. So here's my example. We're feeding pigs, and I need an 18% crude protein diet for these pigs. I've selected corn and soybean meal as my protein sources. So I'm going to give corn 9% protein value. If I look up in the table, that's what it's going to tell me. And I'm going to use soybean meal at 54%, so it's really high in protein, okay? So those are my 2 ingredients that I'm going to use. So this first method is called the algebraic method. 2 variables, right? So we are going to assign the 2 variables would be corn and soybean meal. So we're going to say X is corn, Y is soybean meal. Okay, X is the amount of corn, Y is the amount of soybean meal. So if I set up my equation, I simply put how much protein I've got on the left, the ingredients on the other side, right? So remember, it's in decimal form. So I've got 18% here. I want to use that as a whole number. And this is going to be 9%, 0.09 of the corn and 0.54 of soybean meal, okay? Now, if you think back to math, Simple math. I've got two variables with one equation. I mean, is it possible to solve that? The answer on that would be no, right? One equation, two variables, we can't solve it. So I need to create a second formula, a second equation. So keep the first equation in mind because we're going to come back to it. But the second equation, I want you to look at it this way. 100% of the diet is going to be X plus Y. We're going to feed X amount of soybean meal, Y amount of, X amount of corn, Y amount of soybean meal, and that's going to be 100% of the diet, right? So that's pretty simple. Now, this is where it gets maybe complicated or maybe confusing. It's not really complicated, but we want to multiply this equation, 100 equals X plus Y, by the negative of the nutrient concentration. So remember that corn is 0.09% protein. Soybean meal is 0.54% protein. So we want to use a negative on that. So now, and remember, we're going to either do it for X or Y, not both of them. And it doesn't matter which one, but I will tell you, if you always use the smaller number, it's better. So I would rather use the corn. So in this example, remember, it's 9% of the diet. So 0.09x minus 0.09y, okay? We multiply a negative throughout the whole equation. Or you could do it with the 54, okay? But we're giving that value all the way across. All right, where am I stuck? Oops. All right, either will work, but I like to use the lower number, okay? So let me kind of scroll down here. It's easier to discuss. So then I'm going to line them up, okay? So I took equation 1. Remember, I want 18% of the diet. The crude protein of the diet is 18%. Corn is 9%. Soybean meal, which is my Y variable, is 54%. So now when I line them up like this, I simply add them going down. So 18 minus 9, those two cancel out, and 54 minus 9. So that gives me 9 equals 0.54. I simply solve for Y. Soybean meal is going to be 20% of my diet. Okay? Again, I know this is probably confusing, doesn't make a lot of sense. You can work through this and see how I set it up. Now we solve for X. I simply plug it back into the equation, and I come up with my corn fraction being 80% of the diet. Okay? So again, this is probably the most complicated equation. We could do this whether we have, I mean, not very often. That's why I chose pigs, is because I can use two ingredients. But if I was using something else, I'd have to have 3 or 4 ingredients. And you can do it. It gets kind of ugly. I guess I lied to you. This is 3 ways. There's really 4 ways. And so the 4th way is the one that I use. And I'll tell you about that one at the very end. So, okay, so I made an example. If I decided to go with the larger the soybean number, so it works out exactly the same, except that I'm solving for soybean, so my X would be corn. I'm using soybean in the equation, but solving for corn, same thing. I still get the exact same answer, okay? So check your work. Comes out to 18%. Remember, 20% of the diet is soybean meal. Soybean meal is 54% protein. That gives me 10.8 units of protein. Corn, 80% of the diet is 9% protein, gives me 7.2 units of protein to give me 18%. Okay? Check your work. Make sure it works out. Now let me show you the next ingredient, or next method that is a little bit simpler in my mind. It's still the algebraic method, but I'm only going to use one variable. So I'm going to set the ingredient that is the highest crude protein as my X. Okay, so in this case, that's my soybean meal. So X is going to equal the soybean meal, the percentage of the ration I want. So remember back, X plus Y equals 100, right? Well, now I'm going to say 100 minus x is what corn is. So I wanted to keep them both as an x variable, if that makes sense. Because as you'll see, what I'll get to is I can actually solve the equation if there's only one variable in it. So x is soybean meal, 100 minus x is corn. So if I set up my equation, 18% protein, I got 0.54x is my soybean meal plus 0.09, which is the protein content of corn, and I multiply that times what my corn variable is, which is 100 minus x. So if I went through and did the math, you're going to get, you just work down through this, a basic algebra equation, and I still come up with the same answer, right? So this one to me is a little simpler if you don't get confused on the fact that you're just taking 100% of the diet minus the soybean meal is my corn fraction. I mean, if you can think of it that way, it stays relatively straightforward. And then you do the same thing. You're just solving for x in this case. All right, so this is mathematically, Pearson square is my third method. Mathematically, this is the simplest, most straightforward one, okay? So I'm a nutritionist. If I have to balance a diet and I've got two ingredients, I use this one every time. I'm not a real great math major. As you can see, I probably struggle teaching math. So simply draw a square. Put the protein content in the middle. I would guess that most of you guys have seen this already. Put the two ingredients on the left side of the square. So corn, 9% protein, soybean meal, 54% protein. So all I'm going to do is subtract on a diagonal. Don't worry about whether it's plus or minus. You just ignore the sign. So 18 minus 9 would be 9. 54 minus 18 would be 36. So now what I want to do is total up 36 plus 9. That's going to give me 45. So there's 45 protein units, right? So now if I divide 36, the amount of corn, by 45, I'm going to get a percentage, and that's why I multiply it times 100. So it'd be 80% corn. Let's do the same thing on the soybean meal on 20%. So again, this might be confusing, but this is really a very simple way. You just subtract on a diagonal, add them up, and then divide by what that number is, okay? So that's all I got. The fourth one, so, you know, when you take feeds and feeding in college, when you take nutrition, whatever, you're going to have to learn the algebraic method, and it's a pain in the butt, I will tell you that. Since I graduated college, I have never actually used the algebraic method. I have what they call software. So simply use ration balancing software, but it's important to know how to get to the end point. So at some point you need to learn it, but just know that in the future, you can always use the ration balancing software. So that's all I got. If you have any questions, I don't have any contact on the slides, but if you go to UW Animal Science website, you could always find my email. It is, I could just tell it to you, it's Scott, SCOTT, Lake, LAKE, at uwyo.edu. So feel free to email me if you have any questions.
Thanks, Scott. So are there any questions before we end tonight's presentation?
So I have to send in a quiz. I guess the things that I would hope you would know would be maybe the definitions of like an energy classification, a protein classification of feed, probably the three different kinds of digestive systems, some of those sorts of things.
Great. Did you have a question?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, great. So remember, we'll have the quiz posted as soon as we can. So we'll have this available so you can go review it if you need to go through it again as you're taking the quiz. And then, of course, we'll get the video of the recording and the quiz posted just as soon as we can get that up there. We'll let you know when we have that. So Appreciate you taking the time to talk to us tonight. I learned a lot myself, Scott, so thanks for that. And I'm going to